On my recent trip to Galveston, I took a walking tour that turned out to be quite fascinating. Now, on this tour, we learned of Galveston's rich mob history, how it was a vice city for many decades, ran by mobsters, and actually prospered in this time period of being ran by mobsters. Now, this city has a quite rich history, all the way back to pirate Jean Lafitte, and was once the brothel capital of the world. Now, this tour I took was supposed to be a ghost tour, but ended up being more of a fascinating history tour, which I thought I would bring to you guys. Quite interesting. Join me on the adventure, shall y'all? We start our walking tour downtown, and Galveston's always had a bit of a seedy past, all the way back to the days of the pirateers and the privateers. Now, do you guys know the difference between a pirateer and a privateer? Well, one of them works for the government, kind of like a common day criminal that would work for the government, and the other one was just a straight up criminal, but they both criminals. Now, governments have often worked with the syndicate to use them as enforcement, clean up a town, different things. They actually work together a lot more often than people would have thought, especially back in these days. And that's the part we're going to get into next here. Now, the Roaring Twenties, Galveston was known as a vice city, or an open city, or even called a free state. What this meant is they was kind of looked the other way when crime and any type of vice went on. That's brought in nightclubs and brothels and gambling and drugs and all types of vices you could imagine. Now, anytime you have vice that's running a city, two things are going on. The government's being paid off, or the local law enforcement is, or they're in on it, and the syndicate is the one making it happen. And that brings us to the two barbershop brothers. They came here from Sicily when they were children, first in New Orleans, then as teens moved over to Galveston. And that is the Maceo Brothers. For 30 years, Big Sam Salvatore Maceo, along with his brother Papa Rose Rosario Maceo, the Dons of Galveston, ran the ports, nightclubs, gambling, bootlegging, and various other vice. Now, they did this with the help of another prominent syndicate family, a family they were tied to by marriage, the Fertitus. Now, you've probably heard of the Fertitta family, as Frank Jr. went on to begin an off-strip casino named the Bingo Palace, now known as the Palace Station, and all the other station casinos in Las Vegas. Now, some of the Fertitta offspring went on to own the UFC, and even the Houston Rockets, along with one of the largest restaurant companies in the world, Landry's restaurant chain. Now back to the Maceos. Now, during Prohibition, the Maceo barbers quickly became the Maceo bootleggers. By paying off the police, judges, and city council, they quickly rose to power. They took an old warehouse and turned it into a distillery. Now, to keep the Maceos looking like legitimate businessmen, they owned other companies that were legitimate businesses, like a fish house, a concrete company, a dairy, and a trucking company. Now, during the time the Maceos ran Galveston, the town prospered. The community said they never felt safer than during this era. Now, crime was almost unheard of during this time, and a lot of legitimate businesses and families prospered as well, such as banks, hotels, and prominent families, the Moody's, Seelys, and Kepners. Now, this helped to produce a fantastic vacation spot with lots of stuff to do and lots of infrastructure. Maceo's really prospered from the nightclubs they ran, because they also had gambling and supplied their own liquor. Now, one of the Maceo's other big sources of revenue was prostitution. The house of ill repute, where they often had the blessings of City Hall and the Catholic Church. Many people don't know it, but Galveston had the largest red light district in the world at this time, boasting one hooker for every 62 citizens. Now, by comparison, Chicago had 1 to every 430, Paris 1 to every 481, and Shanghai 1 to every 130 people. That's a lot of prostitutes per capita. Now, make no mistake about it, the Maceo's nightclubs were top notch, and many people don't realize that before gambling was legal in Nevada, Galveston was the Las Vegas of the Southwest. The Maceo's owned several clubs, but 2 of them really stood out: the Balinese Room and the Hollywood Dinner Club. These were top-notch clubs. Now, these clubs boasted some top-name performers of the time, like Frank Sinatra, Bob Hope, and many other prominent acts. Matter of fact, Big Sam loved Frank Sinatra's Palm Springs home so much, he had the same architect build him one on the island. By the late 1940s, the Maceo's stronghold on the island had faded. With Las Vegas opening as a legalized gambling spot, off in the desert, most of the syndicate had moved their operations out to Las Vegas, including Big Sam being the primary investor in the Desert Inn, along with the Fertitus. Now, by the early 1950s, both Big Sam and Rose were in the ground. So, with the police and the politicians no longer on the payroll, state law enforcement quickly swept in and, quote, cleaned up the town, end quote, meaning that the government would control all vice on the island instead of the syndicate. An interesting fact I found out doing the research here told me that it was pretty crazy to me, but the last brothel wasn't closed until 1991. That's a long time to be open with no syndicate protecting you. Makes you wonder. So even though the Maceos haven't been in control of the island in almost 80 years, some would say shorter time, but that's what it says in the history books. You can still enjoy their presence at the import store and deli at 2706 Market Street and enjoy some fabulous New Orleans style food, from crab and shrimp gumbo to muffalettas and beignets. On a side note, from all the research I was doing here, I came across something I thought was interesting. The original Pleasure Pier, which was helped along by the Maceos and the Fertitas' involvement in the Galveston economy, was open all the way from the 40s till its destruction by Hurricane Carla in 1961, the strongest hurricane to ever hit the U.S. It was known as the premier pleasure pier in the U.S. It was then replaced by a motel hotel oversetting the ocean on the pier called the Flagship Hotel until its destruction in 2008 by Hurricane Ike. I was in town actually when that happened, so it was a very strong hurricane, very scary hurricane. Well, fast forward a few years, and that very same pier was reopened as the Pleasure Pier by one Tillman Fertitta. Kind of funny how things come full circle. Well, I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed this film, and please shout it out on social media and let other people enjoy it. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.